What's going on in the brain? The neurobiology of what's occurring seconds before the behavior occurs. Limbic system. Amygdala. Amygdala damage equals they can't detect fear-evoking faces, they don't look at the eyes. Can't take sensory information. Testosterone, make the amygdala better at looking for fear and anger-evoking faces. Lateral geniculate. Is a shortcut, which makes the visual system be one synapse away from the amygdala. It can get you fear-evoking, arousing information much faster, than going through the traditional cortical processing. The downside is that the information is less accurate. Faster information, less accurate. Which is hyper-excitable in people with post-traumatic stress disorder. Amygdala. Fear, anxiety, aggression. No afraid equals no aggression. Exceptions. Williams syndrome. Imprinted genetic disorder. You get kids who are facile with language and emotional expressivity, but have an IQ of about 70. Presumably, because there are specific cortical areas for language. They're extremely trustful, gregarious, vulnerable, or being taken advantage of. And you can't evoke amygdala activation with scary faces. Social phobias. Any face is a scary face to them. Clinical depression. The amygdala activates when you show them something sad. Because the amygdala activates to whatever is most frightening to you. Amygdala is responsible for dichotomizing between us and them. Forms categories, in-group, out-group. Responding to out-group stimuli. Frontal cortex. Appropriate context for sexual behavior. Also, regulates appropriate behavior in violence, aggression, competition, cooperation. The limbic system is about subcortical structures underneath. The cortex is about the cortex. So, this is the cortical part of the limbic system, involved with limbic and emotional function, with bidirectional connections between both. Frontal functions. When you have to choose between doing something harder or easier, and the harder thing is the better thing to do, the cortex makes you do the harder thing. There are more inputs in the easier one. That's why it's easier to activate the easier neuron. The harder pathway have 2 axons. The easier pathway have 3 axons. The frontal cortex gives more strength to the harder pathway to do the harder and right thing. Frontal projections are diffuse and weak, but biasing towards excitation to the harder pathway, rather than causing it. Dopamine is the fuel for all this process. High dopamine equals you do the harder and right thing. Because inhibits the easier pathway. Dopamine drives the behavior needed to get the reward that you're anticipating. Dopamine as goal-directed behavior. Frontal cortex helps you to organize bits of information, to make it easier to make sense of. CVLT. They give you a test, somebody tells you 16 different items, and then ask you to say which ones do you remember. Around the 4th round, you realize 4 items are fruits, 4 items are tools, whatever. Since then, you start telling the info through groups, like first the 4 fruits, then the 3 tools, etc. until you remember all the 16 items. This is called executive function. Executive organizing strategy. Your brain is telling you, don't just remember the sequence, and try to keep track of the categories, because it's a better strategy. You get somebody with lesions on the frontal cortex. He can remember all the 16 items. But he will never do the grouping. More people with frontal damage. Frontal temporal dementia. You get to the people o'clock. And you tell him to point at the 11:10. And he would put the clock at 11:10. Inhibit the easier route, when something it's already very well learned. You ask him. Starting with December, tell me the months of the year backwards. They say, December, November, October, September, October, November, December. They pull it off for a while, and then they go back into the easier way. Then you tell him to do the same, but with counting to 20 backwards. And he say, 20-19-18-17 September, October, November. So now, they've slipped back into the previous task. Frontal cortex in the cognitive realm. Makes you work, for a cognitive reward. Gratification postponement. Monkeys. You put electrodes in the visual cortex, and others in the frontal cortex. You give him a task, to press 3 times a lever when a light turns on. Every time the light flashes, the visual cortex activates. Meanwhile, the frontal cortex activates, and it stays up the whole time. Visual cortex equals individual task. Frontal cortex equals remembering the rule. The frontal cortex works very hard. The frontal cortical neurons have very high metabolic rates, which makes them very fragile, they die very readily. Neurological disorders damage the frontal cortex with behavioral changes. In the frontal cortical realm of remembering things, at some point, it becomes automatic. The frontal cortex stops being the area that is active, and become implicit procedural pathways stored elsewhere in the brain. Like when you learn to go to the bathroom, run, etc. In individuals with Alzheimer's, you get damage to the hippocampus and the frontal cortex. Things that they learned enough to just be habitual, they can still do it. That's why she remembers when to go to the bathroom, etc. The cerebellum seems to be part of the brain, in charge of the storage of automatic things. Harder and correct things in behavior. Phineas Gage had massive frontal damage. A metal rod flied through his head and rip off his frontal cortex, because of an explosion of dynamite. And because the metal rod went through with such force and so fast that it cauterized all the blood vessels, that he was able to walk a mile and a half to the doctor. Later on, he became a brawling, abusive, sexually predatory out of control. 80 years old guy, who raped an 80 years old female, because he had frontal cortex damage due to a stroke. 25% of men on death row in USA, have a history of concussive head trauma to the front of their head. Mcnaughton rule. Can the individual tell the difference between right and wrong? Mcnaughton was a paranoid schizophrenic. He attempted to assassinate the Prime Minister of England in 1840. He was the first case of the jury saying that he was so sick to hold him responsible for his acts. They consider this, because he didn't try to cover up his tracks. This mainly happens in people with severe schizophrenia. Like John Hinckley, who tried to assassinate Reagan in 1980s. He failed the Mcnaughton rule, because of severe schizophrenic. But some people with frontal damage can tell the difference between right and wrong. Yet, they can't control their behavior. Experiment. Right hand has 5 MNMS. Left hand has 1 MNMS. If he goes for the right hand, 5, you give him the left hand, 1, and vice versa. People with extreme frontal damage will be never able to go for the left hand, 1, because they can't remember the rule. And people with low frontal damage will remember and tell you the rule, but they'll end up picking the right hand anyway. Almost all the states of USA don't have the Mcnaughton rule. If someone has his frontal cortex destroyed, it doesn't matter, he's guilty anyway. E.g. 1. A guy. 9 murders. But when he was 6 years old, he had a massive car accident that destroyed his frontal cortex. He spent 2 months in a coma. No prior history of antisocial behavior. By age 11, first assault. By age 13, first murder. At some point, one of his victims was a woman. He raped her, beat her, 4 weeks. Eventually, he had her wallet, and saw her name, where she lived. Then he bundles her into his car and drives her home. As he lets her out, he says, "I had a really good time, I hope you did too, here's my phone number, maybe we can get together again sometime," and drives away. Then, at the court, he could distinguish between right and wrong. Also, the fact he had his frontal cortex damaged so early in life. Around 5 or 6, the person never quite incorporates the rules either. You get acquired sociopathy. So, you can't incorporate the rules, and can't act on it. At the end they give him death penalty. E.g. to somebody. When he was being born, there was a birth complication, they had to use calipers, something slipped and caused frontal damage. Now, he's unconstrained by the laws of society. He can't regulate his behavior. In family reunions, he plays the piano for hours. Because he can't control his behavior. Some people become murderer and can't stop it, some people are pianist and can't stop it. If you have no frontal cortex, but tremendous family support, money, opportunities, you can have different behavior. When your frontal cortex is least active, REM sleep, your brain cortex is shut down entirely. That's why your dreams make no sense. Development. Your frontal cortex is the last part to fully form the all of the myelin on its axons. Complement of synapses and branching connections. It's fully developed around age 25. Which makes it the part least constrained by genes, and most sculpted by environment and experience. In kids, around 5. If you damage the frontal cortex, you get the acquired sociopathy. You know the rules, but can't carry them out. In teenagers, dopamine spikes go way high if they get a reward. Dopamine goes way down if they don't get a reward. Compared to adults, the dopamine-driven metabolic changes in the frontal cortex are more dramatically large. It's a system less regulated. You can't have death penalty applied to someone who committed a capital crime between ages 16 and 18. Because, explicitly stated in the Supreme Court, the brain and the regulatory areas of the brain are not fully mature at that point. In adults, around 25, the frontal cortex is the third most vulnerable brain region to normal aging. One motor system in your brain called substantia nigra, which loses most of its neurons with aging, related with the tremor of Parkinson's. 2. Hippocampus, loses substantial percentage of its neurons with age, memory problems. 3. Frontal cortex, loses lots of neurons. Abnormalities in frontal function. Repressive personalities. People highly capable of controlling their behavior. They don't express emotions, bad at reading emotions. They're not depressed or anxious. They have resting metabolism in the frontal cortex. Sociopaths have much lower than normal metabolic rates in the frontal cortex. Also, under certain circumstances, they have a hypometabolism in the frontal cortex. If he wants to regulate his behavior, they need a lot more of the frontal cortex. Frontal function in other animals. Chimps on the average can do the same task with the MNMS, but you need to do it with pieces of wood, instead of chocolate. Frontal function in kids. -1 marshmallow. A kid in a room, and you tell him that he can get 2 marshmallows if he doesn't eat this one before you come back. The length of time a kid could hold out when he's 5 years old, is predictive of SAT scores years later. You got a 5-year-old. You play hide and seek with them. You count to 10, and you say, "Here I go, where are you?" And he will say, "Here I'm, behind the piano." Then, is their turn. You tell him to count to 10. And he's like, 891011121314. All because they can't inhibit those responses, due to his small frontal function. At 5 years old, there's a relationship between your socioeconomic status and the thickness of your frontal cortex and its resting metabolic rate. The frontal cortex is one with the highest levels of receptors for glucocorticoids. Glucocorticoids atrophy neurons on the frontal cortex. So, be raised with the stress of poverty. And at 5 age you have difference in the size and activity of your frontal cortex. We don't know why most people become murderers after they have frontal cortex damage, why it is so tightly involved with the regulation of the amygdala. Amygdala regulating the frontal cortex. Frontal cortex-amygdala equals inhibitory, to restrain itself. Amygdala-frontal cortex equals inhibitory. To stop sermonizing at it. In rats, primates, and humans, there is an inverse correlation under resting conditions between the metabolic level in the amygdala and frontal cortex. They move in opposition. The amygdala silences the frontal cortex equals you make really bad decisions and inappropriate behavior. What happens when you extinguish a behavior? The amygdala activates less and less. Destroy the frontal cortex, and the amygdala never can't learn to stop being afraid. Frontal cortex silences the amygdala equals produce the harder behavior. They always work in opposition. Septum. It also works in opposition to the amygdala. Hippocampus-fornix-septum. Septum inhibits aggression. All these limbic structures are trying to influence the hypothalamus. Lateral hypothalamus. Predatory behavior, foraging. Anterior cingulate. Behind the frontal cortex. Empathy, compassion. You feel the pain of other individuals. Josh Green. Moral decision. You and a bunch of people are hiding from the Nazis who are nearby. And a baby is crying. If he keeps crying you will get caught and killed. It is okay to smother the child. He shows that people who actives the anterior cingulate less, they're more likely to say it's okay to smother the child. Descartes error. The notion of the separability of thought and emotion. That's nonsense. Partially separate frontal cortical function from limbic function. Josh Green. The runaway trolley problem. A trolley is going to roll over 5 people and kill them. 1. You pull a lever, which will make the trolley divert onto a different track, and kill 1 person. 2. You're behind a big beefy person, and you can push him onto the track. The trolley will kill him, but will stop it from hitting the 5 people. 75% are willing to pull the lever. 25% push somebody onto the track. Which means, is harder for people to do wrong things, when it depends on their hands to do that bad thing. People thinking to pull the lever, the cortex activates. People thinking to push the person, the limbic activates. Oliver Goodenough. Put people in a scanner. They've been on a mock jury trial. Now they receive on the scanner the judge's order to the jury before they go and deliberate. 1. The judge tell him you need to decide, was the law violated or not? Rule bound. Cortex is activated. 2. The judge tell him the system is about protecting the weak from the powerful, empathy bound. Limbic is activated. Interactions between the two. If you damage some of these structures, you change all the decision that are made. Give them the trolley problem. And they're more likely to push the person. Transmagnetic stimulation. You turn off one sub-region of the frontal cortex. And they become more utilitarian. Or more selfish, etc. How the brain does metaphor. Like symbols, abstraction, etc. But we have a very old evolutionary brain that not evolved for doing metaphors. As a result, the brain does the metaphorical stuff with the old circuitry. Thus, when dealing with extremely abstract issues of decision-making, we treat the metaphorical components as if they were real. E.g., temperature regulation. There's an old circuitry for it. Now, some volunteers. They get in an elevator. Somebody comes in with a bunch of books, and ask him if he can hold his cup until they go up. First case, the cup is iced tea. Second case, the cup is warm tea. The person spends 15 seconds holding the cup. Then, they ask to evaluate the personality of the person they just interacted. If the person had the warm tea, they rate the person as having a warmer, more expressive personality. E.g. 2. Anterior cingulate, related to empathy. Go eat, or smell something rotten. And the insular cortex will activate, which processes foul, disgusting stimuli. Now, tell somebody a story of somebody getting exploited in horrible circumstances. And his insular cortex will activate. Or, ask him to tell you a story when he did something wrong, and the insular cortex activates. That explains why every culture has terms that intermixes literal sensory disgust with moral disgust. I'm disgusted, it makes me nauseous. E.g. 3. You ask people to tell you something wonderful or neutral or moral transgression they did when they were a kid. Once they tell you his story, you say, I can't pay you, but I can give you a set of pens, or a flash drive, or a set of soaps. The people who tell you their moral failings, they're more likely to choose the soap. Then, you allow him or not to go to the bathroom, to maybe wash his hands of metaphorical sins. Now, in the test room, one person comes in holding a bunch of books, and accidentally drops them. If the person washed his hands 1 minute ago, he was less likely to help the person. Jonathan Haidt. Moral decision-making is not decision-making, it is effective decisions. Affect drives the decision-making. E.g. 1. You tell somebody, 4 scenarios. A history of 2 siblings who want to have a sexual incestuous relationship. It is okay for them to do it in private? Your elderly grandmother says it's absolutely fine with her to slap her in the face. It is okay to do? Burning a flag, and stomping on it? Something laden with symbolism, but at the end it's just some cloth. You're hungry. Your pet has just died. Do you eat him? At the end, people can't give a rational explanation of why people make their affective decision before their cognitive ones. Of why is so important that you cannot step on some cloth that has a pattern. But it's okay to step on a random cloth. It just doesn't feel right. All of this examples, telling us that the old circuitry of the brain is not very good separating the limbic world from the cortical world. Neurons and aggression. Hypothalamus nuclei, midbrain, brainstem, reptilian parts. But they're just doing the nuts and bolts of the sympathetic nervous system. You cannot tell the difference whether a person has murdered someone or just had an orgasm. In both cases the neurons do similar things. Elie Wiesel. The opposite of love is not hate, the opposite of love is indifference. Applied to physiology. The sympathetic nervous system, the stress hormones, love and hate are not opposites, they're physiologically very similar. But also, tells you how readily some humans psychopathologically can confuse the two states. Hormones and aggression. Testosterone and aggression. Testosterone is required for aggressive behavior in males. In castration, do levels of aggression go down to 0? No. The more prior experience being aggressive, less drop of aggression. Put back 100% normal levels, and aggression is reinstated, put back 10% and the levels also are reinstated. So, your brain can't tell the difference between moderate, medium, or high levels of testosterone, he only cares if you have testosterone. If somebody has super high levels of testosterone, you can't predict if he's going to be aggressive. If you see correlation between the levels of aggression and levels of testosterone, the behavior is driving the testosterone. E.g. 5 rhesus monkey males. Put them together and they form a dominance hierarchy. Take number 3, and pump him up testosterone. And now, he will be involved in more fights. But he's not threatening number 1 and 2. He's being a nightmare to number 4 and 5. It's exaggerating the pre-existing social structure. Testosterone modulates, it amplifies. Don't turn on aggression, it increases the volume if it's already turned on. In neurobiology, raise testosterone levels, and the amygdala activates more, it is easier for the amygdala to perceive as threatening a scary face. In the cellular level, neuron get an action potential dash the action potential occurs dash refractory period, it is silent for a while. Now, Testosterone shortened the refractory period. Which means, the electrical activity of testosterone in the neurons and the amygdala, it does nothing. Only if the neurons are already excited, testosterone will increase the numbers of them. Testosterone does not cause it, amplifies it. Amplifies pre-existing social structures. Spotted hyenas. Females are dominant to males. Females are bigger, muscular, aggressive. Females have higher testosterone levels. If you look at their private parts, you cannot tell who's which sex. Females have androgenization, they have enlarged clitoris the size of penises in males. They have something that looks like a scrotum, this are compacted fat cells. And they look like males. Hyenas have sex reversal androgenization. Females produce high levels of androgens in their ovaries. In lions, males eat first, then females, then cubs. Most lion cubs starve to death in the first year. In hyenas, cubs eat first, then females, then males. As a result, you get a masculinization of the genitalia in the females, and they wind up having a different signaling purpose. In primates, males to display their dominance, they get an erection, due to certain wiring of the autonomic nervous system. In hyenas, males get erections when they're terrified, when they're under stress as a subordinate gesture. And low-ranking females get clitoral erections, when they're threatened by high-ranking females. Females are dominant, more muscular, and more aggressive, but they're like that, because they're more hormonally like males. He tells a very interesting history about some military, who gathered with a bunch of carnivore biologists to tell them how predators hunt.